welcome to Just Thinking. This is Mary Greendale. The title of this show grew out of a lifetime of curiosity about many different subjects, some local, some global, and some in between. For each show, I will open with my thoughts and then bring on guests who explore the subject in greater detail. I hope the show inspires healthy discussions on camera and among viewers. To me, the sky's the limit when we are just thinking. Hi, I'm Mary Greendale, Just Thinking. We're here today to talk about guns, part 2. Last week I interviewed Jim Wallace, who is the executive director of the Gun Owners Action League of Massachusetts. He came on and through a scheduling snafu of my own making, I didn't get all 3 people on at one time. So today we are going to try to pick up where Jim and I covered and see if we can go forward a little bit. With me are Bonnie Steinroeder, who's the senior minister for the First Congregational Church in Holliston. Welcome, Bonnie.
Hi, Mary.
And John Moore, who you may remember as the former police chief, who now comes back to us as a college teacher and a lawyer. So anyway, I feel comfortable having both of you here. This is good. So to get started, I just want to try to kind of have a level playing field. Do either of you want to abolish the amendment, Second Amendment?
No.
Okay.
No, not at
So
all.
we're not going to have a kind of discussion is basically that basic. This is out with it. All right. Then let's go on from there. When Jim was here, he really kind of caught me by surprise because I'd never thought of it this way. He caught me by surprise when he said guns were a civil right. And I understand where that's coming from, but in my mind, I immediately think of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its relationship to people's individual, race or their whatever, access to a job or an access to education. So I had never really thought of it this way. What do you think about this being a civil right matter, John?
I'd agree with this characterization. I'd say that any rights you find in the Bill of Rights are civil rights. You might not think of them as such on a regular basis, but he is right, and it is one.
Okay. As a civil right, we have a right to regulate it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's where we are,
Yes.
basically, as a nation right now. To what
Yes.
degree can we, should we, shouldn't we? And I'm becoming increasingly frustrated as I realize that because we all have different levels of regulation in our states, sometimes we're talking at each other. We assume for the moment that everybody's got what we've got, no matter which state you're living in.
Right.
Okay.
And that's not true.
And it's just there's so much education that has to happen in terms of educating people about what are the range of options that are out there already in play.
Right.
Where has it worked? Where has something worked? Where not? But anyway, so. The 350 million guns that are already in circulation are one of my bigger concerns. That's just my own, personal thing. What do we do with those? If you have gun regulation, how do you ever? You don't go out and confiscate those. I can't quite picture us with armies going out,
No.
But you can have a buyback program, right? I mean, I'd be interested to know what you think, because I have heard that, I know Framingham just had a buyback program in their town.
Did that work?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how their program worked out, but typically a gun buyback program is when people come in anonymously, turn in a gun, even though they might not, in fact, have a license to carry, and get paid for it. It's not your typical gun owners, trying to cut down on their inventory. So it's police departments set this up so that people that might have an illegal gun will turn it in, and that won't get used in a future crime.
Right.
It's kind of like amnesty for my books at the library.
Yes.
Yes.
But I also think, so I've heard this argument before, and I worry about all the guns that are out there too, but if we use that, I've often heard it used as an excuse then to not promote any regulation because, well, it won't matter because we already have, all of these guns out there, and we do have to come up with creative ways to deal with that, but I don't think we should use it as an excuse to not begin now to have regulation.
So where would you begin?
Where would I begin?
Yeah.
So in the great state of Massachusetts. I think I wrote you both in an email, or maybe I just wrote Mary, but I went to an event last week over at Framingham High School. It was a Moms Demand Action event, and they had the police chief from Framingham speaking, and he talked about, and I don't know why I didn't realize this, but I didn't, he talked about, he went through what the gun laws are in Massachusetts, and in some ways, I mean, he didn't say it this plainly, but he was saying, really, it's a model for maybe what our country could use. Maybe you can't transfer it everywhere, but he was correlating to that the fact that we have very low incidence of gun violence. Now, he did say we can't be complacent. It doesn't mean we don't have any, but there is a correlation, he felt. And I'd love to know, do you agree with that?
Sure. I mean, you're talking about Chief Ferguson, right?
Yes.
Who's a proud alum of Holliston High School, same class as me.
I didn't know that.
Oh, there we go.
I have great respect for Chief Ferguson. He has a very tough job. Policing a town as big as, or city now, as big as Framingham. But he's exactly right, and I'd agree with it, that the model we have in Massachusetts is that good. You know, we could go into great detail in terms of the regulations, but they fall down into statutory disqualifiers or a suitability disqualifier. And the chief of police for any city or town in Massachusetts will go through that anytime someone either tries to get a license to carry or they renew it. So I think it is the model that should be replicated in as many states as possible. But then again, we're in Massachusetts, and
it's a bubble.
And
it's a bubble.
I can't, you know,
Florida,
I can't advocate what should be done in, say, Florida or Montana or wherever. Right.
But it is a place, you know, that we could begin conversation, I feel. And Connecticut, after Sandy Hook, took, you know, it made more stringent gun laws, and they have seen a reduction in their gun violence. Just one thing I wanted to say is that it was also the first time I had heard that a police chief could deny a gun permit to someone who was unsuitable. And that actually made me feel really great, because anytime you have someone involved in one of these shootings, they always say the person was known to police. But in many states, if you don't have that, there's nothing the police can do. You know, the police may have been there 40 times, but until, if I'm right, until they actually do something or threaten something, there isn't anything you can do. But if you knew about that person and that a person applied for a permit, the police chief could. So I think that's a great law, personally.
Background checks. When Jim Wallace was on here, he said it didn't. So they have not solved one crime.
Did he have proof for that?
I don't know. No, he didn't. Let me say, I don't know what he would say, and I need to be careful not to.
Right.
You know, I'm not attacking what he said, but it's like, all right, so.
Because it doesn't make any sense.
How do you know whether or not it's
right?
So did you? In police crimes, I mean, I'm assuming that you would go back to records of, did somebody own a gun? I mean, it would be one of the things you'd be looking at.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
How do you know? How would you know if it solved a crime or not?
You wouldn't. And you wouldn't know either solve one or prevent one. Right. If you do a background check when someone's applied for a license to carry and you deny them, then they go on their way. Whether or not they commit a crime, we don't know. Could be in a different state, could be in that state. Right. Those background checks are in place for police chiefs to determine whether or not someone is statutorily disqualified or unsuitable for a license to carry.
One of the conversations that I found, or one piece of the conversation I found the most interesting, was that because we have become so unfamiliar with guns, we don't see them. Whereas in my day, they were around. My father carried a gun for protection when I was growing up. His business happened to be in a difficult part of the city of Springfield. Even in the 80s and 90s, you know, people would have their guns, and they were visible and so forth. It wasn't, I guess, until the late 90s that we said you can't have them visible. But that's actually made the problem more difficult from a gun owner's perspective, in that people have become unreasonably afraid of the guns themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not afraid of the guns. Well, no, I mean, I know people who own guns. I know people who go to ranges and they practice. So I heard that point, and It's true, right? I cry when I hit a squirrel. I'm not out there hunting, right? But I know of people who hunt, and I don't have any value judgment on them for owning guns. I'm not afraid of them because they own guns. I'm afraid of the proliferation of guns and how many guns we have and how easy it is for people to get guns who shouldn't have them. So I don't know. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, is your concern that the guns that are carried on the street are carried concealed?
Yeah, I think he was basically saying if they weren't concealed, if people saw the shotgun in the back of Billy Bob's truck, you know, all the time kind of thing, there would be less of this anxiety about them.
That's more of a cultural argument, right? That in areas where they're, because that would scare me more to see the shotgun in Billy Bob's truck or to see the woman walking around with what, you know. But yet, in there are areas of the country where that's culturally very accepted.
The other thing I think you got to keep in mind is if you expose every gun that's out in the public, that's another gun to be taken away from someone, stolen, used against someone.
Right. You mean you could become a victim by virtue of carrying one or being obvious?
Right. I mean, there's two sides to it. You know, you carry it concealed and you're the only one that knows it, or you carry it openly and you've now given an opportunity to someone that might want to take it.
That's a good point.
Interesting thought. I mean, if you're carrying a gun, if I'm carrying a gun in my pocketbook, I wonder if I become more conscious of where I'm leaving my pocketbook. You know what I mean?
I would think you would.
You get a little paranoid about your pocketbook.
Well, toddlers have shot their mothers from finding them in the pocketbook. But
why was it loaded? I mean, that's just, you know, I mean, some of this stuff is just beyond the pale.
But that's a really good point that Chief Moore that you make, because I hadn't thought about that, right? I'm walking around with a gun on my hip. I encounter you, and you want my gun, you're going to overpower me to get that gun.
There's that possibility. I mean,
in my case, you just go like this and I fall down.
But I mean, that's only because of where I came from, and you're taught at the police academy. You not only display a gun, but you might take the gun out. There's a possibility someone could take it away from you. So you got to be prepared to protect it.
And I had that conversation with the student resource officers when they were here. How did they answer to children who say, "Can I see your gun?"
Right.
The answer is no. It only comes out when I need to use it. It's not a toy. It's not a, this is not a display. Whatever.
Right.
So that's all part of what you're talking about.
Right.
Well, it sounds like Jim's concern was that people who are gun owners, especially in Massachusetts, where we're a very liberal state overall, that maybe he's feeling that they're misunderstood or whatever. And so the answer to that isn't really to to display your guns and walk around with them. It's to have a one-on-one conversation and let people get to know you. That would be my approach.
And that's what we are trying here to do.
Right here.
So everybody agrees that mental health plays a major part in what happens with these guns. I mean, they don't do these things by themselves.
Right.
But how do we tackle that? I mean, we're talking about a humongous problem. Let's talk about Holliston for just a minute, because I think we have been exemplary in terms of that wonderful arrangement from now almost 10 years ago, when the fire department, the police department, the school department, and the youth and family services all got a grant that was basically the court diversion, became the court diversion program. That program, I think, again, should be a model anywhere, because what you're looking for are those at-risk people, the people that, give them a chance, give them one chance. And, if they fail then, well, then they're back into the court system. But how do you do that nationally? I mean, we're just one teeny little, place.
Well, I mean, every chance you get, you talk about that program, whether it be here, whether it be at a town meeting, a community meeting, or if you're out of state at some meeting and you talk about this program that we have. I mean, the jail diversion program, which you're talking about, we had a clinician for the last 3 or 4 years that I was chief that would ride around with our officers on the 4 to 12 shift, specifically trained in recognizing and to a certain extent diagnosing mental illness, which our police officers are not trained in.
Right.
And it was a great tool. And I think we helped a lot of people, and we avoided a lot of court action or something even more tragic.
So But here's the thing. I think about mental illness. When I think about the United States, like I'm trying to think about why are we so unique? And yes, we have a Second Amendment, but they have to have mental health issues in Canada, in Australia, in England, and yet they do not have the kind of gun violence that we have. So it's not just that there's mental illness, it's that people who are, and I don't want to paint a broad brush because most people who suffer from mental illness will never harm anybody.
Right. They're usually self-harm, maybe.
And it tends to be, at least if you look at the latest shootings, white men, young white men. The Las Vegas shooter was not young, but also a white man. So more than just saying, for me, you know, what are we going to do about mental health? I also feel like, what is it about our country that uniquely we're having an issue with our white men and our young white men? And it's anger really more than mental illness, because I would hate for people to think that people who suffer from depression, people who, I mean, are a danger in some way, because I don't think that that's true.
No, that's been documented that that's not the case. And violence is the issue, and the anger is what produces violence, not, you know, mental health. But going back to, you know, kind of what do you do about it sort of thing, even Jim said the 18 to 25-year-old is the biggest dark hole. Okay, so we have here in the state a wellness program, as he described it, a wellness visit. So if you have, I'm assuming the police have an opportunity to go to a house to check on you know, some question, whatever. Does that go away if we put in this new bill that is the red flag, what do you call it, extreme risk thing? Because that was part of the conversation, was that it looked like all that you would be able to do under the new bill, instead of the wellness visit, is to hand out a pamphlet, which we agreed was rather meaningless.
I don't know the details of the new bill well enough, do you?
I've read through it. You actually were kind enough to provide it to me. I see them as two very distinct avenues to address this. I mean, wellness visits will always be there.
Okay.
You know,
separate statute or separate regulation, or
I mean, I could call for a wellness visit.
Not even a statute. I mean, what you're talking about with, you know, the new bill, that if it passes, it'll be a statute. But wellness visits have been around forever. It's someone calling up saying, I'm concerned about someone, can you go talk to them? We don't have to pass any burden in terms of just talking to someone. Now, you could go to a door and you could say, you know, knock on the door and say, can I come in and talk to Jimmy? And if they don't want to let you in, then you're not getting in. But, you know, usually, well, I'd speak for our offices in this town, they're very good in terms of using their discretion, in terms of using their words properly. And their only purpose is to make sure that that person is okay. So there's no statutory background to it. There's no burden of proof before you reach out and talk to someone. If you have to take it to the next level, which would be through that statute, then you would. But in most cases, I don't think you'd have to go that far.
So are we, if you go to a home, are you sort of, if you put them through this new program, basically is giving you a legal channel through the courts by which you get the okay to go in and perhaps take their gun away. Are we then stigmatizing the depressed guy who's got the gun and maybe he's going to use it against himself more than anything, because suicide's the number one, you know, that's the number one kind of gun violence that we have. In that case, are we making it worse for him? Now we've taken this depressed person who's going to be publicly exposed to a court process and made to feel even worse about himself.
Well, I mean, you know, I listened to your broadcast with Jim, and he properly cited, you know, the laws under Chapter 123 that would be the next step after a wellness check if we didn't feel comfortable walking away. And one was a Section 12, which is a psychiatric examination, and the other one is a Section 35, which is an examination for either an addicted drug user or alcoholic. Those are both courtroom procedures overseen by the judicial branch. And I mean, I think the number one priority is the wellness of the person. The firearm is secondary. And we don't see it as stigmatizing. We see it as assisting and helping.
So what is this conflict that he talked about between the mental health professional advocacy groups, and because we don't see that here with our youth, the Youth and Family Services, and you guys seem to find some ground in which you could share what was happening without violating someone's confidentiality or his rights or stigmatizing him.
Yeah, I don't think so. First of all, I think if you talk on behalf of the whole mental health community, of course, different therapists are going to have different viewpoints on things. And the only thing that I've heard is that people are concerned that with all the talk nationwide about mental health and the link to guns, that people not be stigmatized in that way. But I was just thinking exactly what you were saying. You go to someone's home, they're depressed, you do a wellness check, there are firearms in the home, you decide to take them away. Yes, on the one hand, you could say we're stigmatizing or bringing out into the open, but maybe it's a great thing to bring it out in the open. Maybe that person will finally get the help that they need. Maybe they've been living alone. Maybe no one knew. You don't know, and I think each case is individual, and there's always going to be a reason why you say, well, if we take this step, this might happen. But still, you have to look overall. Overall, is it going to be a help? Is it going to prevent more suicide? Is it going to prevent more gun violence? And that's always where I fall down.
Yeah, and it's not a foregone conclusion that they're going to lose their gun rights or their guns. I'll just throw out an example. You get called to do a well-being check at someone's house, and you get there, and say it's a young man in his 20s, and he's out of sorts. Say a friend of his had just died unexpectedly, and you suggest to him that he goes for a psychiatric examination, and he goes voluntarily. The police chief in that town could say, listen, I see these circumstances as not rising to the level where I take away his license to carry or his firearms. The intermediate ground might be, for the time being, I'm going to suspend his license, and then, I'm going to check in with him in a month or two, and if everything seems to be back to normal, and maybe we'll bring our clinician with us to verify that, he gets his license to carry back and his guns back. I mean, it's not the end of the road, but the number one priority needs to be the person.
Right. Agree.
When I hear people who are staunch gun rights, I don't even like that word, who want to have their guns and don't want them regulated at all, okay? When I hear them, I sometimes hear a strain of fear, because many of them really do see that gun as being the way they're protecting their kids, their wives, their family, their homes, their property, and in some cases even their nation, because there is a fear among some, and I don't even mean wild extremists like the folks out in wherever, Colorado or whatever, Idaho, who protest
sovereign nation
types. Yeah. Those folks are really scared, and yet on the other hand, I also hear real fear from people who are really terrified of guns, and I can respect all of that, but getting to both sides to sit down and talk is the challenge.
Though, here's what gives me so much hope. If you do a survey of most Americans, Republican, Independent, Democrats, there are so many points of agreement. Most Americans believe in universal background checks, right, which for private sales, for things like that. A majority, and the whole assault weapon ban is a whole other topic, but still over 60%. But let's just take universal background checks. 99% of all Americans agree on that. The reason we can't get it done is because politicians are beholden to the money for the NRA. And I remember I had the pleasure to be George and Barbara Bush's minister when I was up in Maine. And I would say that that George H.W. Bush is a conservative, is a Republican, is a gun owner, and around the time when I was still there, he left the NRA because he said it no longer represented the majority view of gun owners. It represented a very a minority extremist view, and politicians represent that view because they take millions of dollars from them. And so I really think we have a lot more agreement than we think we do. Especially if you say there's always going to be extremists on both sides. The rest of us, I think, are all on a spectrum where we could agree. I mean, I don't know. Do you think that it's a pipe dream, or?
No, it's not a pipe dream.
I don't know. You've been on the
No.
streets more than I have. I tend to be the
No, not at all.
idealistic,
Not at all.
ex-hippie. But I still believe that we could come together, right, if we can get past the rhetoric and listen to each other.
Yeah, well, if you could get past Congress.
Yeah, I mean,
ignore them, not get them to pass
Right.
something.
right. I mean, a couple things I think have to be said up front when that discussion starts, which is, I see your Second Amendment rights as a civil right. I'm not in favor of mass confiscation. And then that puts the other side, if there is another side, at ease.
Yeah.
And you can have that discussion.
Yeah.
But it's funny how quickly it flips back.
Yeah.
That
Oh, yeah.
fear underneath there is just like a tiny little flicker that's always there.
Right.
And I don't know how you get past that at a big level unless you have real leaders at the top,
Right.
at the same time echoing the sentiments of what's
Right.
being done at the bottom.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Although we'll see. Maybe these kids will turn the whole equation
I'm
upside
pretty
down.
hopeful and pretty excited about that.
Now, to a gun owner, Massachusetts makes it too hard to get a gun.
I wouldn't know because
You haven't, but what do you think? You were responsible. Let's be honest. There are a lot of places. I know that there are any number of times out in western Massachusetts, which is a bigger farmland country, where people want and need their guns more for, frankly, shooting the critters that are raiding the chicken house or whatever. So those folks are much more likely to want to be able to access their guns, and their police chief can control their use, and so they, whatever. There's some unhappiness that having that one person in a town who gets to decide whether I get a gun,
But you don't care if people shooting their chickens, right? I mean, you're not going to deny or the animals getting their chicken. That's not what you're going to deny a gun for.
No. I mean, I think police chiefs take that responsibility very seriously. Obviously, if they're not statutorily disqualified, then the only issue is suitability. And there has to be good grounds for it, or it's going to lead to litigation.
What is suitability?
Suitability is a subjective term, defined by the police chief that's involved, looking at all the facts and circumstances as to whether or not this person should be in possession of a firearm. But it is subject to oversight through litigation. A person that applied for a license to carry that is not statutorily disqualified but is denied for suitability reasons can appeal to the district court immediately.
Right.
And get a hearing, and a judge can determine whether or not the chief's reasons were valid.
Right, so it's not like there's no recourse. It also feels like that's just kind of the argument of fear, right? Like, I would like to know, have any of them experienced a police chief denying them the right to have a gun so that they can shoot the raccoon that's raiding their chickens, right?
Well, and it may, I may have been offering too benign a situation.
Right.
Okay, so some guy just wants to have a gun, and he's known to be a barroom brawler. Okay, and he comes in.
It's more along the lines
It's more
of that.
along those
Yeah.
kinds of things, I think, that you'll find
yeah.
it. And then the question becomes, as you said, very subjective. And, the guy may think that I can control my temper, but he's on one end of the gun, and
Right.
somebody else is at the other end.
Right.
And feels differently.
And I always err on the side of safety. I mean, it's a civil right, but it's not like food and water. You don't need the gun in order to live. You can still have a healthy, happy, productive life if you don't have guns. So it's not like someone's taking away your basic right to live. So for me, to err on the side of safety just seems reasonable.
Yeah. But
To me, that seems
to
very
them, you
reasonable.
see. But if you're talking about safety, and my biggest fear is the outside world attacking my family, my little den, my little, whatever, and hurting my family, then to me, you're taking away my fundamental safety.
Actually, that's a question I would love to hear. I would like to ask former police chief, because I'm under the impression that most of the time, guns that are in the home for protection, more often than not, are turned turned against the people that they're meant to protect. That you can have a gun in your home, but if there's an intruder, you're just as likely that that intruder could get the gun away from you and harm you. I mean, how many instances do you see where people have shot an intruder and protected their home? Do you think that that happens a lot?
Not too often.
Yeah.
Very seldom.
I do think, and again, it would probably be very different outside the realms of Massachusetts.
Right.
I do think that that is a legitimate concern in some parts of the country where people are farther apart. I also think that the numbers are very, very different, because if you, there's a wonderful website that just collects the statistics. That's all it is. It's Gun Archives or something like that. And all it is statistics. So you can just sit there and read through them until your eyes blur. And they're up to the minute. Literally, it's in the moment. If somebody gets, dies right now, that thing is changing. So you've got this real-time thing, and when you look at it, you realize that what happens with the whole thing is, well, I'll do it this way, a bell. You've got that. So you've got, this is everybody, with the least regulation all the way down here is at the bottom of the bell curve. And up at the top, I think like we're the second or the third one. So we've got this teeny little line, and then down here it's all these people who have died, in gun violence and so forth. But somewhere in the middle, there still are a lot of people who've defended themselves with their guns in their homes, on their persons, and so forth. And they're afraid not to have them.
And I don't think anyone's saying that they can't. I don't think anything that we've talked about with regulation has said that they can't do that. That's, where I feel like maybe it gets misunderstood.
Yeah.
Just because I'm for regulation.
Need that. We definitely need that rabid gun advocate here to stir this up, because I'm hearing in the back of my head the voices that I hear, when I'm not here, when I'm collecting comments on Facebook or the emails that I get and stuff like that. And it's like they really fear that every one of these things, what's their term, slippery slope? Every regulation, everything is just slowly narrowing down.
And yet most of them own a stockpile of guns, so that actually isn't true. And there are so few regulations. I feel like what happens too is that the NRA feeds that fear. They have their own channels, they have their own radio, they go on and they say, these people, don't listen to them. Don't have a reasonable conversation, because what these anti-gun nuts are really trying to do is take away every single gun you have. And I feel like they feel, they feed that paranoia.
Well, that's a common practice, whether in politics or in anything, to feed the fear. We see a lot of it these days.
Yeah.
But John, from a standpoint of, I'm sure, at least one or two people who are rock-ribbed, you can't take my gun. What would they be saying about us? That we're just...
Well, hopefully they wouldn't misinterpret what we're saying here. I'm saying that, keep the regulations in place that we have, at least for this state. I know there's efforts at the federal level and there's efforts in other states. The federal government has taken upon themselves to put out certain regulations, so they share the regulatory power with the states. But you have to follow whichever one is stricter. And I would say in Massachusetts, in terms of gun ownership, it is stricter.
Massachusetts rules are more.
Yes. I mean, whether it be what you can buy, the size of the clip, the amount of ammunition, the amount of firearms that you can sell in a year, the background checks. But I think it's a great system.
It seems to be working. That's the thing. It really does seem to be working here.
What about the AR-15?
What about it?
What about that gun? That is a civilian weapon. That's what, I'm reminded over and over. Do not tell me that's a military weapon. That is a civilian weapon. Okay.
It's a civilian version of
a military weapon. Okay,
right.
But, words are interesting. How you parse them. You have to know this is an attorney.
Oh, yeah.
It's all which word came, right in that sentence at the right place, the modifiers and so forth. So I mean, they're very concerned too about that whole. You take that gun away, or all of the quote assault weapons, which again is not a military term, but that's another discussion. The point is, what do we do with those? There are so many people who are afraid of them because they are rapid fire, and you don't need to be as accurate a marksman as you do with a rifle, a pistol, or
Well, and
whatever.
there's a reason that the mass murderers are using them, probably because they can kill, a lot of people very quickly for all the reasons you said.
Do we keep them?
I think a lot of people, I look at it differently, or this differently than most people, and I say to myself, people can buy them in the state of Massachusetts, but that can be prevented by a police chief who holds that power over the license to carry. It is an extremely accurate gun, semi-automatic, so you still have to have one pull of the trigger for each bullet to come out.
But you can pull very quickly.
You can.
And I also have heard that the damage they do is different than in that they are designed to do maximum damage, and so that would also be a concern. Is that not true?
I mean, I don't know if we want to get into that discussion in terms of ammunition, but and I heard Jim's talk, and he was very accurate in terms of the ammunition itself, whether it be rimfire or center fire. It is a lighter cartridge, but travels at a greater speed. So if you had a pistol and you had, say, a .45 caliber, that might do more damage than an AR. They both, I mean, they're all going to do damage.
They're all going to by any one of them.
Well,
right. They're all.
No.
Where the person gets wounded means a lot. The condition of the person, the type of ammunition.
Yeah, where you get hit with it.
All these, and how the person reacts after they get hit. I don't know that we want to go down.
No. But I will say this, that this is where maybe, and I don't know if we differ on this or not. So it's fine, right? We have a Second Right Amendment. People can use the guns to protect themselves, to go hunting. But even I was reading over the Heller decision, which is talked about a lot, and even the Heller decision, it said that we do not have a fundamental right to own that type of gun,
a military gun.
Right, a military gun.
Yep.
That yes, we have the right to own a gun, but I feel like it's just like every state I go into, I know that I have to stop at a red light. Some states I might be able to turn right on red, and some I can't, but I have to stop at that light in every single state. And so I feel like, for me, assault weapons kind of feel in that same way, that I can't see how anybody's life would be worse off because they couldn't own one. They could still hunt, they could still defend their family, they could still enjoy marksmanship if that's what they enjoy doing, but it does feel like we would be safer without them. So that's kind of where I come down.
I would like to hear how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I know enough people who would say it is fun to shoot an AR-15.
I mean,
it is a sport.
Fun, somebody's life. Fun, somebody's life. How do you weigh that?
I know, but
car, somebody's life.
Violence perpetrated through the use of a firearm can be with a handgun, can be with a rifle, a shotgun. Sure. There are unfortunately many times during the year we hear in some of our major cities gun violence. Usually it's a handgun.
That's right.
Mass shootings. Usually it's a rifle. I mean, I think we got to keep coming back to the person and get ahead of that, whether it be with the mental illness, with people saying something when they see something. There's a great book out there. I don't know if I should even throw out the title, but it's called Left of Boom. And what it means is, boom is the incident, okay? And most of us concentrate on how we'll react or respond or recover afterwards, which is right of boom. You got to get left of boom. You got to recognize these pre-indicators that someone might perpetrate some form of violence somewhere. You need people to tell law enforcement what they know. Law enforcement needs to be aware. And you got to do it on this side. You can't wait for the incident.
No, but then how do you answer the question? Because this is, and I don't have the answer, this is what I'm struggling with, that again, I believe that other countries have to have all the same issues that we have, and yet they still don't have that kind of gun violence. So even if we get left of boom, is that what you said?
Yep.
Even if we get left, even if we get, and we should do all those things, and mental health is a huge issue, it does seem like the country that has the most guns and the least regulation has the most gun violence. And I don't know how you get past that.
I do think you have one huge difference, and I think, and that is our basic culture. We were founded on the backs of those guns. Those guns were the defining element in our settling this nation. And like it or not, you know, we were bred out of violence. Okay? Our whole history is just smack full of it.
Right. We do have a unique American culture,
We
you
do.
know, that
We
we
do.
have to deal with. And so,
And those guns are a big part of it.
they are a big part of it.
They're a huge part of it. And I think they've gotten even to be a bigger part of it since entertainment has become so prolific with gun experiences, even though the weapons may be done in you know, Star Wars that doesn't look like the guns that we use today, or all of those other forms of entertainment where it's all about shooting at something or someone. I mean, that's far more prevalent than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So that plays a role in it too. How do these other countries treat that stuff? Do they have that kind of proliferation? I don't know. Is there a market for them even in those other countries? In this country, we lap them up apparently.
I would think so. I mean, if you mean like video games, and
Yeah,
I would
all
think,
that stuff.
I would think
Well,
all
even the
those other
movies.
countries
I mean-
also have the same, in the same way. But I guess the other thing too that I was just thinking about on the way over here, as a minister, of course, I get up and I preach on the Bible. The Bible was written a long time ago. I wouldn't dare stand up in the pulpit and preach a sermon without knowing the context of which that passage was written. Who was the audience? Why was it written? Why were they saying that? And then my job as a preacher is somehow to make it relevant for today. And I feel like, and I wouldn't say we should throw out the Bible because it was written a long time ago, and I wouldn't say we should throw out the Second Amendment because it was written a long time ago. But I think it's fair to say when that was written, they could never have foreseen the kinds of weapons we have today and the damage that could be done with them. So I do think it's fair to honor it for what it is, but also say it was written in a certain time and context, and how do we make it today so that it allows people to have their rights, but also allows us to be safe.
Well, I think that gets into the Supreme Court issue of, you know, whether you are a strict constitutionalist or if you are a modern constitutionalist, which is to say you believe that the Constitution should be updated, so to speak, to reflect, you know,
Right, but I mean,
different guns.
are you just doing that with the Second Amendment? I mean, you can't do it for one and
not do
not
it for
for
the
the
other.
other.
I was thinking about that, too.
So when you
Right.
talk about gun rights back in 1791, are you talking about freedom of speech and its context back
1791?
then? Are you
Right.
talking about a reasonable search and seizure back then? You know, the right to counsel, all the civil rights.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want anybody to unfairly single out the Second Amendment and say this plays into my narrative better if I say that was then, but all the other ones I'll interpret as today.
Yeah, no, I did think about that too.
Yeah,
Then you have to look at them all, except for the Second Amendment seems, the gun violence is such a real problem.
See, in another way, no, it's not. You know, in terms of, if, it all depends on where you, not where you come from, but looking at the numbers of people who die by guns and die by cars, numbers of people, if you look at the comparisons that they do, how people die, you know, gun violence as opposed to suicide being the #1 use of those guns, but, you know, gun violence perpetrated against somebody else is not that big by comparison to
Right, I
some
mean,
of these other.
I'm surprised, well, maybe he did, but I know probably Jim Wallace knows that I think there was a figure out there one time about people that die of medical malpractice, which is more prevalent than gun violence.
Yeah.
You know.
So it all depends
So
on.
I'm going to push back on you just a tiny bit.
That's fine.
On that, and say, it's one thing to say that there's, you know, more people die in cars, you know, also we have more we have cars on the road, people get, but I think that it doesn't mean that gun violence isn't a big problem. We could say car accidents are a big problem, gun violence is a big problem, but I don't think just by saying, well, more people die, you know, from the flu this year than whatever. I mean, it is a big problem because our children are afraid to go to school. It's a big problem because when I go to the movie theater, I'm looking at the exit. I'm figuring out. It's a problem because when I'm preaching in front of my church, I'm worried if somebody's going to come in the front door. It's a huge problem. in our country. So I really feel strongly about that.
That's good. I'm glad you got that out. That's good. And in your church, or our church, I guess,
Yes, you're still a member.
Never show up. But anyway, it is unique because people can get in at the ground floor and then walk upstairs, and that's where the congregation is. I mean, it might be even harder. I mean, easier for somebody to sneak in than in another church, you know. But anyway, I don't know why I digress there. My head is still busy with what we're basically saying is how you die can be quantified, you know, and one has more value or less value than another. I thought about the man down in, I guess it was Charlottesville, that used the car that ended up killing just the one woman. I mean, you talk about bad luck, you know, and luck does sometimes account for some of this stuff too. But you know, to be that one person that got hit by a car, but really, you could take a car and run over lots of people. In fact, it by accident happened to somebody that I know very well who got run over by a car that jumped the curb, not deliberately, but you know, killed him. It could become a weapon.
Yeah,
you know,
lots of things can be weaponized.
You know,
I mean, we just
the guy down in Austin.
You know, with the bombs.
Mailing you bombs. You know, mail a bomb today.
Yeah.
There are just so many places that we have exposure and so forth that, again, going back to sort of the really big 60,000-foot view, is what is it about this country that makes us violent using whatever means or methodology that we have? What is it?
Right.
That is, we're just not that peaceful.
And see, then you'd have to have a show with 2 psychologists.
That's true.
Right?
That's true. Yeah. We'll stand by and learn. So
the other thing that I did think was helpful with Jim was when he talked about the no-fly list, which is one of those things that I always think of, well, that's a no-brainer. And yet I actually know somebody that was on the no-fly list, and it took her years and years and years. Actually, she grew up here, Laura Poitras. When she was doing her videos that she ended up winning an Oscar for, or nominated for an Oscar for, about Iran and Iraq. I mean, because she was going back and forth there, she was in Yemen, she was in Iraq, she was in all these places that, you know, our enemies would come from. She ended up on a no-fly list. She didn't know she was on it until they started throwing her off the plane or taking away her laptop or, you know, otherwise harassing her. And it took years for her to get off that thing, and a long legal process to get off that thing. So, but nobody knows who's on the list. The FBI keeps that close.
Kathy Griffith, who's a comedian, remember she was kind of banished because she put out the violent cartoon depicting Trump. And she's on the no-fly list, even though she's probably, I'm sorry, she's not harmful to anybody, but I don't know. It seems to me, I don't know enough about the no-fly list to really speak, but it does seem like those at least would be folks to take a look at about whether they should have guns or not. And if the FBI doesn't publish the list, hopefully they could be taking a look. And
I was going to say, couldn't it be just as easy as you send the name to the FBI? I mean, they have a, couldn't they just have a database that you just, you know, you ship them the email and you say, is this person on the no-fly list? And they come back and say yes or no?
Are you talking about in the context of a background check?
Yeah. Is that not feasible?
I mean, from law enforcement to law enforcement, they would probably share that information.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I would think you'd be able to do that, but I don't know.
Yeah.
But some of these things that look like they should be common sense, that being one of them, they don't end up common sense once they get inside government, because government has its own, you know, rules. And I'm not saying the FBI is wrong that it wants to keep this list confidential. You know, it's right until it's not right, and it's you.
But that seems like a small percentage of people and of the cases. And I guess the way I look at it is that, again, we can't use all these things to say, well, then therefore we can't do anything. Right? Well, you can refute anything. Well, that won't work, that won't work, that won't work. Well, some things have worked. And again, I come back to where we started. Things work pretty well in Massachusetts. And again, it could be a model that could be looked at in other places. And I really don't feel, I don't know, but I'm imagining there aren't too many people in Massachusetts who really want to own a gun, who are suitable to own a gun, who can't have one. You know, I think there are rules, but it's not impossible. There are a lot of people that have them. And so I feel like we are proving every day that sensible gun laws can work here in our own state.
The interesting thing is when somebody throws up a suggestion or an argument that
Right.
feels like they're throwing sand in your face, in mediation, and I'm sure you know this, the easiest way is to not push back, but to turn it around and say, so are you saying because
Right.
mental health is an issue
Right.
that we shouldn't be looking at gun regulation?
Right.
And then eventually, you know, if you just keep doing that often enough, you get down to whatever the bottom line is. But that doesn't happen, you know, in our conversations, and certainly it doesn't happen in the media, and I haven't seen any evidence of it in Congress.
No.
No, no.
Of asking those.
That'll be the last place, Mary, that I think that.
Yeah.
But again, who knows with the kids in the you know. But again, I think a lot of it is we sort people into categories, right? And so, you know, we start having the conversation, and we're just saying, well, they're a gun rights nut, or they're an anti-gun nut, or we label them, and we don't listen to what the person is really trying to say.
Yeah, I'd agree. They shut down at some point.
Yeah.
You know.
We all do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We all do. We all have that, you know, instinct, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what these young people are going to do with this. I know there are some people who are appalled at the idea that young people are out, you know, protesting and stuff like that.
Where
And
were
it's
they
like,
in my
I was gonna
generation?
say,
That's what we did.
Come on, people. You have no idea how much fun this can be. And the idea that they're being paid, I had
Oh,
to
that's
laugh.
ridiculous.
I had to laugh at that one. Their parents are making them do this, and it's like, how much luck did you have with your kids? Did you get them to go do what you wanted
Plus,
them
just
to do?
listen to their pain and
Yeah.
their passion,
Yeah.
that what they've been through, and you'll know they're doing it because they're highly motivated for what, you know, for what they've been through. But I think it's always the youth
It
who
is.
make the two
It
leads
is everywhere
change
in
the
history.
country.
Just look at
Yes,
every history.
always.
Doesn't matter whether it's here or Europe or anywhere else. It's always the young people who are, you know, going to make the difference. And well, maybe this is the young group that will do it.
I
Hey
hope
guys,
so.
thank you very much
Thank
for coming
you.
Thanks for
on.
having
Thank
us.
you so much.
All right, next time, right between you, I'll put somebody that's really a rabid gun rights activist. All right, and that'll make it far more challenging for you. All right, thanks everybody. We'll catch you next time. Actually, the next show is going to be on, I can't remember, school innovation. So anyway, thank you, and see you next time.